which will provide an opportunity for us, Africans in diaspora, and also Africans out in Africa, to further consider our role in addressing disability issues among members of the diaspora and, of course, among African countries. We will discuss also the U.S. ratification of UN CRPD and how it will benefit Africans and Americans with disabilities and the challenges of the implementation of the CRPD by African nations. The CRPD was fashioned from the Americans with Disability Act, ADA. Members of Cadus, and I'm using a lot of acronyms here, forgive me, and members and the African Society of the World Bank and all our other partners. We are happy to have you here and we welcome you. As we proceed with the program, each member here at the table will introduce themselves and the institution from where they come, or the institution which they represent. So for right now, I'm going to call upon Sarah Gallagher of Global Diaspora Week, who is the Global Diaspora Week coordinator, to give us an overview of the Diaspora Week. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. I didn't realize I'd be sitting on stage in front of you. Sarah Yousefnejad Gallagher, and I'm from IDEA, the International Diaspora Engagement Alliance. If you guys haven't heard of it before, it's a public-private partnership between the State Department, USAID, and Calvert Foundation, where I work. And the goal of IDEA, as we call it, is to harness the power and energy and resources of diaspora individuals and groups to contribute to development back home. And we try to do this through a few channels. A lot of it really is communicating with groups and trying to get them what they need to achieve their missions. But we try to encourage them through philanthropy, investment in entrepreneurship, volunteerism, and innovation is something that sort of underpins all of those things. Global Diaspora Week is basically a tool to empower diaspora groups and organizations to bring a voice to the issues that they care about, bring a spotlight to them. Has anyone attended the Global Diaspora Forums in the past few years? So IDEA hosted those the last 3 years, and they're successful 2-day conferences hosted in DC that brought hundreds of people from around the world to talk about diaspora issues. But the feedback we got after the last year, and actually that was the year that Cadus was formed, I believe, out of sort of breakout discussions, was that diasporas wanted to drive the conversation. They wanted to decide what the conferences should be about and who would be invited and what format they should take. So we decided to try something new, and that's how Global Diaspora Week was born. And it's a global series of events hosted by organizations and individuals on almost any diaspora issue. I'd say this is one of the more unique events, and I'm excited to be here. We have things from painting exhibition in the country of Georgia to we had a Global Diaspora Media Forum yesterday in Washington, D.C. So the topics are broad, the diaspora communities involved are diverse, and we have 70 events participating in the week. So we're really excited about the overwhelmingly positive response we received from groups. And Cadus is no exception. I've been working with Jeanette and Pius for several months, mostly in communication, and talking to them about what kinds of things their group needs to achieve their mission, because the work that diaspora groups are doing are what keep IDEA alive. So I'm really here to learn more about these particular issues and how African diaspora are contributing to STEM and jobs for people with disabilities in STEM, and to see how that can inform our work. So thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Sarah. According to the we should be inviting Dr. John Riverson. But before Dr. John Riverson comes up, may I call upon Colin Bruce to give us some opening remarks. Colin Bruce is the director in the Office of the Vice President for Africa region, and Colin is responsible for diaspora, for regional integration, and a whole host of other responsibilities in the Office of the Vice President for the Africa region. Colin, over to you, and thank you for being here.
Good afternoon, Baldina, others, distinguished panelists, audience. I want to welcome all of you to the World Bank Group facilities, but also to this special session. I will keep my remarks brief because I am sure you have, I know from the schedule, quite a lot to discuss. But maybe I can offer a few reflections on the course of development work and why I'm hopeful that some of the issues that have received little attention in the past will in fact receive increasing attention as we go forward. And more importantly, your voice in advocating, in raising awareness is extremely important. As Baldina said, one of, maybe put more generally, how to engage countries in climate. One of the things that has happened in the internal discourse within the World Bank Group, and particularly as embodied in our new corporate strategy, which the board adopted in September of 2013, is to clarify, or some might say update, the focus of our work. And in that process, there were two very specific goals that were articulated, somewhat visionary goals. The first was to eliminate, not just reduce, but eliminate extreme poverty by the year 2030. And that means effectively reducing it to about 3% globally. And the second goal is to boost prosperity of the bottom 40%. Now, the reason I cite these goals is that every day I come to work, every day I engage with our clients, every day I come back to this very clearly stated objective. What are we doing to eliminate extreme poverty? And it's not just reduce it, but eliminate that. By way of understanding how this focus is singularly important to Africa, our simulations indicate that by 2030, which is the generational period for achieving this goal, between 77 and 89% of the extremely poor in the world are sub-Saharan Africa. Now, we've done many versions of these simulations, but what we come back to is this fairly robust conclusion that by 2030, however much we have progressed in achieving this corporate objective, Africa will remain a very concerning part of the world from the standpoint of this goal. So what has actually been happening, and what has given me hope, is that as we internalize this newly defined and clarified goal, we are really beginning to enter into new areas of work in which we were not present before. And just to give you an example of areas for which I am responsible directly, we have found ourselves now very much looking at fragile and conflict-affected states and vulnerable groups, and really asking ourselves if we are really using all of the resources of the World Bank Group to support them in their aspirations for development. So, for example, we have found ourselves for the first time providing fairly large amounts of financial support to women who have suffered from sexual and gender-based violence. In fact, earlier this year, our board approved the largest operation ever, 107 million. Now, money doesn't solve every problem, so I don't want to dangle money as a solution. I'm simply using that as a metric to indicate that an area in which we were not involved before is now an area that is receiving increasing attention. As we dig more deeply into this goal, eliminating extreme poverty, we're also finding ourselves, for example, for the first time, really looking very closely at the plight of refugees and displaced peoples. In some parts of the continent, the numbers are very high, and altogether we're talking about 15 million people, not an insignificant amount. In the past, we would say, oh, that's the responsibility of humanitarian organizations. But as we focus much more intently on this very ambitious goal, we are realizing that the dynamics of displacement are changing, and that in fact people are now in a displaced status, not only in larger numbers, but for longer periods of time. UNHCR, which is the authority on this subject, estimates that worldwide, at least these were their July numbers, there are 51.2 million people who are displaced or seeking political asylum or forcibly displaced, and that close to 70% of them are in that status for over 18 years. So this is no longer a humanitarian issue. It is now a development issue in the language of my trade. So one question I asked myself in preparation to my engagement with you is, where does disability fit as we try to get at some of the more stubborn pockets of extreme poverty? And I was struck by the fact that maybe Melinda, when he speaks later, will clarify this. Melinda is our colleague who is responsible for this area of work. Maybe he will clarify where we are on the research, because from my somewhat limited research, what I found was that much of our work in terms of identifying, analyzing the situation of the disabled, much of our work has taken place in the ECA region, the Eastern European and Central Asia region. If one looks at the cohort of poverty assessments we've done through, say, around 2010. Now, maybe it's changing. Maybe we're doing better at it. But I guess my admission to you, and also my plea to you, is that one of the very powerful interventions or roles you can play is really to make sure that as the World Bank Group focuses more intently on those who will be left behind, that we raise the profile, that we measure much more accurately the situation of the disabled. What we know from the literature, at least that I have seen, and there are experts in the field in this room, so just know I'm not an expert, I'm just an interested party. From what I know, from the literature I've looked at, is that there is not full agreement about the link between poverty and disability. And, you know, the data seems to be all over the place. Maybe there's been some convergence over time. But looking at the data that I have seen, there is some dispute as to whether, first of all, the level of the number of disabled, the proportion. There is some, especially in the developed world, there's also some debate about the equivalence between disability and extreme poverty, or at least poverty. But my point to you is that with regard to the African continent, and certainly as interested members of the diaspora or of diaspora-related issues, it's important that you challenge the system and you challenge institutions like ours, and you encourage us and hold us accountable for better analytics around the extent, the nature of disability and what that means for development. And as you know, what gets measured usually gets attention, which is the point I really want to make to you. So as you deliberate, as you use your voice, your resources, your goodwill, in some cases your professional affiliations, my challenge to you this afternoon is to encourage and push on this issue of the analytics, the measurement, the tracking. Because once we begin to do that, then there is a more robust basis in the African context for talking about what disability really means in a broader policy sense. Now, this is by no means to suggest that we must postpone what we advocate for until we have better numbers. That would be, in some sense, foolhardy in my view. But I do think that to get the sort of broader profile and sustained support that this agenda needs, we must ensure that there is better measurement with regard to sub-Saharan Africa, and we must ensure that the analytics about how this links to the corporate goals of a group like the World Bank, that those linkages are very clearly defined. And I couldn't speak to a group that is better positioned to advocate than a group like this one So I would just encourage you to raise your voice and to use your influence to make progress in this area, among others. And what I want to assure you is that in the context of our work within my portfolio, in trying to get at the stubborn pockets of poverty, I will certainly encourage my team to look more closely at who in this group might be considered disabled, defined, of course, in a way that's culturally appropriate, and try to ensure that they are not left behind as we try to upgrade and to advance the development efforts of the World Bank. So thank you very much for allowing me this chance to offer my reflections on this subject, and I wish you very fruitful deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin, for you've given us something to chew on, and we appreciate that, and this will contribute greatly to guiding our proceedings going forward and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Please excuse me, I do need to go back to leave. Thank you. Thanks. I do need to leave because we are in the midst of responding to the Ebola crisis, and part of that falls within my area of responsibility, and it's a very changing dynamic and very urgent, so I'll excuse myself if that's okay with you.
Thank you so much. We appreciate. So we will call upon Dr. John Riverson to join us up here or at the podium, whichever works. Riverson will give us an introduction of the program, which could have happened earlier, but Colin had explained that he has to run to multiple events in connection with the Ebola, as he has just mentioned. And so we gave him the floor before we could get this introduction of the program from Dr. Riverson. So please, Dr. Riverson, go ahead and give us the introduction of the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I thought I would first say how privileged I am, how honored I am to be able to speak on behalf of the Consortium for African Diaspora in the United States, and all the partners that joined together with us to organize this event. Now, Cadus, as you'll get to familiar with, is an organization of collaborating African diaspora groups with varied interests. So you see people who are interested in various types of support that Africa needs. And the consortium believes that it is our obligation to serve all members of the African diaspora with and without disabilities. So our sacred duty is to support and serve and protect our brothers and sisters with disabilities. We are keenly aware of the vulnerability of people with disabilities here in the United States and in our home countries. Therefore, we are trying to draw attention to the plight of persons with a disability, and this found our place in the Global Week, which Sarah had earlier explained to us. As a group, we intend to highlight and address the plight of African disadvantaged children, especially those with disabilities, who are not being accepted in society or are not receiving basic education, as well as women who wish to pursue the goals of becoming scientists. People with disabilities in general, and in particular poor and disadvantaged children, are likely to become begging street children unless action is taken to change this situation. if you walk around the streets of Addis Ababa, you walk around the streets of Accra, you will see examples of people who are just begging and not in school because of their disability, one form or the other. And therefore, when we set out, we said the world, we believe, must abandon placing barriers in the way of women and of children. The Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disability, which the UN enacted around 2006 or so, and which we have learned is fashioned again after the American Disabilities Act, gives us a stepping stone for us, a radar screen with which we can begin to measure how we can operate in our efforts to address the needs of persons with disability. This forum then gives us the chance to get different people who are working in different areas of interest to be able to present some of their experiences and to guide us in moving forward. This is certainly not the end of the story. In fact, it is only the beginning. And therefore, this forum should enable us to do that. And we call upon you who have been invited and who are interested in sharing with us that we will get ideas with which we can move forward. And in the end, our bigger partners, like the United States, who have the experience with regard to disability issues. And as some of my friends with disability were telling me, they still have room to go, but definitely compared to Africa, there's a gigantic step versus a very small step. Therefore, we expect that if they put their muscle behind the CRPD or the convention, it will encourage African countries, some of whom have signed, and you see that in the concept paper that we have presented earlier, that some of them have signed, but what have they done is the question. And those who haven't signed, what are they going to do to sign it? And the question is, which partners are likely to go with us, who have been trying with our small steps to make a difference in the continent? So as a result of this event, we hope that we will learn some more for that. And I think earlier on, Berdina spelled out some of the discussion points, so I wouldn't like to go over them all over again, because it's in the agenda and we will be able to see it as it plays out. In the meantime, we'll begin by hearing from the practitioners who have been in this for a while, and then use the platform to showcase some of the challenges and opportunities and things that we have done with members of the diaspora group in trying to advance the cause of the disabilities. So I believe this is how I would introduce the program and ask you to join in thinking through and finding ways to do this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Your very apt introduction of the program. If I may take this opportunity to just repeat for those who may not have it at the tip of their tongues or mind that CRPD is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I'm sure most people in this room know about it. And as John just said, you know, we want as many countries to sign into it, to ratify it, as many as possible, and that is significant because African countries particularly, the disabled have very hard time. I mean, in some countries we are now even beginning to have ramps in buildings. In many countries and many cities and many buildings, especially in Africa, it's not even the law to have a ramp for a disabled person to wheel themselves up into a building. And it's just impossible. I mean, you see, if you go to the atrium of the J.D. Wolferson atrium here at the World Bank, you're going to see a little kid holding a stick for an older man who is blind. So that means that, and that comes from the that project that we had on the Blind River project, river blindness project that the bank has been, and I think continues to be implementing or funding. It means that when one person is disabled, a child in that village or that home is going to be disabled as well, because that child's life is going to be cut, and that child's job will be to hold a stick and be the seeing dog or the seeing eye of this disabled person. So it's really something when we talk about disability and the whole array of disability, which we need to really think about it properly. Now, having said that, I'm going to call upon Dr. David Morsi, who is the director of the United States International Council on Disabilities. Dr. Morsi, it is your turn now. The mic is yours.
Great, thank you, and what an honor to be here. Thank you all for joining us today. I have to correct, I'm not a doctor, but thank you for the promotion. I'm the Executive Director of the United States International Council on Disabilities, and we do have a PowerPoint, if we could bring that up. I'll be very brief today in my remarks, but I want to thank Cadus for embracing the disability topic for this year's Diaspora Week. This is the crucial and right moment for diaspora communities to look at the status of people with disabilities in our home countries and wherever we live, because this is a global phenomenon, not disability, but disability empowerment. That's the phenomenon. 1 billion people with disabilities, because of the CRPD, are rising, standing, calling for equal access to the classroom, equal access to vote and to participate in elections, and to be treated fairly in seeking a job, or how they are regarded and treated in the workplace. And so much of this is being driven by the CRPD. The treaty is really changing the world. Yes, slowly, yes, incrementally in different communities, but also we see these really profound jumps forward as countries really get their hands on the commitment they have made at the UN, at the international level, to tearing down barriers and building a society of opportunity for their disabled citizens. They're making it real, and every day something happens, little or big, and it's an exciting moment that is one that calls for all of us, with and without disabilities, I believe, to stand in solidarity, because it's really for everyone that the tearing down of barriers and assuring the basic human rights of citizens with disabilities is crucial. Our work, do I have a thing, or you just want to, okay. So our work at the U.S. International Council on Disabilities is to bridge Americans with disabilities with the world disability community. We're a membership organization, and so many of the disability groups in the United States who may focus on one community, such as the blind community, the Association of the Deaf, and many others, they are our members, so that we can focus on the international relations piece and allow them to do what they do best here at home, which is serving Americans with disabilities in education, the workplace, and social development. We have a variety of initiatives at USICD that include our CRPD education and advocacy campaign, which includes, we are the leader of the coalition for the United States to ratify the treaty, which I'll get to in just a moment. We also have launched a program in partnership with USAID that I'll love to share with you as I close today, called the Global Disability Rights Library, where we have particularly developed a network of partner disability organizations across the planet with a very significant emphasis in Africa. So I'm excited to share that today, because it's an example of how civil society organizations, non-governmental groups, can be working to make the CRPD real and to empower people with disabilities. We serve as the U.S. member in a few international organizations and have standing at the UN what's called consultative status. We work with Disabled Peoples International, DPI, and Rehabilitation International, RI. There really is a growing global network of professionals, volunteers, and advocates who are building the acumen of the World Society in moving policies and practices forward for better disability engagement. So Persons with Disabilities is the first international treaty to address disability rights globally. The CRPD does not establish new human rights, but rather it sets out with greater clarity the obligations on states parties to promote, protect, and ensure the rights of persons with disabilities. The CRPD promotes non-discrimination, full and effective participation and inclusion in society of everyone, respect for difference and acceptance of persons with disabilities as part of human diversity and humanity, equality of opportunity, and accessibility. The treaty, the CRPD, sometimes I call it the treaty for short, because really what it is, it's an agreement between countries. I have a copy here. You can also visit un.org/disabilities and find it, or at our own website, usicd.org. And I encourage everyone to look at the treaty because it really does cover the span of the life experience of society, from childhood, education, to rehabilitation, the workplace, civic participation, voting. The whole lifespan is thought through in the treaty. And it's a guide star. Someone said earlier that it was a stepping stone. And it is being used for the metaphor of a guide star because no matter where we are, we can see that star and we can follow it. And the CRPD does not create those laws for a country who sign or ratify it. They must still do that work at home. And they can use the CRPD as the framework, as the guide star to implement the treaty at home. And I think, as both of our opening speakers remarked today, that monitoring piece, how are countries implementing, how is data used for the implementation, are really crucial components that a variety of governmental and non-governmental leadership figures are really trying to get our hands on and our heads around so we really can make effective progress in CRPD implementation. So where's my country in the mix? Where is the United States with CRPD? Senator Barack Obama was the only candidate for the presidency who pledged that he would sign the CRPD if he won the election. He won the election. And within 7 months, we were so pleased that he did sign the CRPD, or he ordered his ambassador at the UN to sign it for the United States. That was an exciting day. It fell on the 19th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which again references the integral inspiration that the ADA has played in the development of the CRPD. And again, as countries have signed or ratified and they're now looking to implement at home, they're going back to the ADA to really look, how do we do this? What's model legislation we can look at? Countries are all at a different place in this journey of realizing this non-discrimination goal and the vision of the CRPD. And so we have a real opportunity as part of my appeal to the United States Senate to be at the table with countries around the world, share our knowledge, but also listen and be a real collaborator in advancing the CRPD. In this picture, these are all athletes from the U.S. Paralympic team. They came onto Capitol Hill to advocate for the treaty. The gentleman in the middle is Congressman Jim Langevin. Congressman Langevin's in the House, so he doesn't get to vote on the treaty, so he makes a great treaty advocate. Whereas our game really is in the Senate. It requires what's called a supermajority. We need a minimum of 67 if all 100 senators show up that day. We need a supermajority or 2/3 vote to achieve ratification. We had a shot at it in 2012 and we fell 5 votes short. So close. And immediately our both Republican and Democratic supporters, both sides of the political aisle who are with us, we have bipartisanship on this issue, said, don't give up. we got too close to just give up. We can get this done. And so we've been working and building the movement, and it's larger than ever. Over 800 disability organizations, veteran organizations, religious and faith organizations. We have the business sector largely with us, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, large companies, IBM, Verizon, AT&T, all supporting ratification, and countless others. We really are the American mainstream calling on the U.S. to embrace an international human rights agreement. Unfortunately, we do have an opposition. There is, as you may know, an opposition in the U.S. and some communities to anything out of the United Nations, or the idea that we would support an international human rights standard such as the CRPD, because then the world community will be looking at us. I disagree. I think that the opportunity for the U.S. is to be a global leader and to say we are happy to be looked at how we have made progress on disability rights in the U.S., and we want to be at the table with our neighbors around the world. We certainly want to support the idea that as countries tear down barriers and create opportunities, that American citizens who travel overseas are regarded as equal citizens with anyone else. Certainly our veteran community, the wounded veterans from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, particularly today's students with disabilities, have an expectation, having lived under the ADA, that the world should have that same level of accessibility that they're used to here, and they're looking to their country, our country, the United States, to get that done. So I ask you today to stand with us in solidarity. If you have a Senate relationship, to make that call to your senator and ask them to support ratification. I am available to you after the presentation, certainly anytime, for ideas and ways that your communities could be a voice in this. But that solidarity with our disability or our disabled brothers and sisters around the world has been what has fueled our passion and kept us not giving up and fighting. We're hoping we can get a vote in November when the Senate returns from their long recess. They're campaigning right now. They should be back around November 12th. There's no reason they can't take this vote. So if we could just go forward, we'll wrap this up. I just wanted to share this anecdote of this exciting project. The Global Disability Rights Library, we can go forward again, is a project that recognizes that the CRPD is inspiring countries to seek guidance and knowledge sharing on how to do disability rights, and that disability communities in non-ratifying countries continue to promote ratification. DPOs, or disabled persons organizations on the civil society or non-governmental side, are particularly called to stand up, just as our campaign in the U.S. is doing, in countries around the world. Disability non-governmental groups, or DPOs, need advocacy tools, capacity building, knowledge sharing, and the tools to be a force for advocacy in their own countries. So if we could just go forward. And so this project, we could keep going forward, was a work to network with 60 disabled persons organizations around the world to help seed that knowledge. If we could keep going, I think what we'll do, sir, is just go. Keep going till you see a map on the screen, and then we're going to stop. There's people using the technology. There we go. So this, it may not be the easiest to see, so I'll just share. Countries that we, with USAID, have a network of disabled persons organizations include Bangladesh, Ethiopia, India, Indonesia, Kenya, Mongolia, Nigeria, Peru, Tanzania, Zambia, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. These organizations are doing the daily work on the ground to educate people with disabilities, empower people with disabilities. Sometimes they're focused on one community, education for the blind. Sometimes they're big NGOs who are working not just on disability issues, but on women's entrepreneurship, women's rights issues, poverty alleviation. And so by working in this collaborative way with these NGOs, I think we really can make an impact. This was a seed project from USAID that just ended. Our first 3 years is now done. So I'm looking for partners, for ways that we can now take the relationship with these great 60 locations to the next level. How can we get in, do some training, do knowledge sharing, exchange, connect people across borders to share, well, this is how we're moving non-discrimination in my country. This is how we're creating access to the classroom in my country and share that knowledge. As I opened by saying, it's an exciting time for the global disability community. I thank you for standing with us in the march forward. Thank you for standing with the United States disability community to bring our country to ratify this important human rights document. And finally, thank you for being here and listening to me today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Modelci. We appreciate your presentation, and the two challenges you've given us is to call our representatives regarding the signing or the ratification of the CRPD, and also these 60 locations around the world. Our next level is to see how to support these groups and many other things. So we thank you for that.
And I have a few handouts I'll leave on the outside table.
Appreciate it.
Project. Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now we are coming to our next speaker, a very, very committed champion for the disability. I'm about to give the floor to Judith Human. Judith was here at the World Bank with us, and if you want any champion for disability, I don't think anybody can hold a candle to her. I'm sure everybody's doing great, but I tell you, Judith is the ultimate advocate. I know everybody's great, but Judith, please join us.
To start off by thanking Jeanette and John and all of you who've put this together, and to say that we need to continue to gather data to substantiate, legitimize poverty rates for disabled people, but quite frankly, the World Bank put a report out in 2011 with the World Health Organization, which says that at least 15% of the world's population have disabilities, and 80% of those people live in developing countries. And given the status of many African countries, I think it's irrefutable that disability is part of poverty. It's a significant part of poverty, and that as Colin challenged us all, it's our responsibility to make sure that World Bank and other development banks, in fact, step up to do what they need to do in order to ensure that issues affecting disabled people are a central part of the work that the World Bank is doing. I think we need no longer to be arguing that we need more data to be able to determine whether we have a significant percentage of disabled people in Africa who have disabilities and who are living in poverty. I think that argument is finished. And the issue we need to do now is to ensure, for example, that when data is being collected and when the World Bank is involved in the development of questions for the collection of data, the bank has a responsibility to ensure that disability is a part of that data collection. I was very the reason I came today is because Jeanette called me, and I kind of do whatever Jeanette asks me to do, and I know that she's been working really hard on this. And let me say that I work right now at the State Department. I'm their special advisor on disability rights. I've traveled to Africa a number of times, both when I was here at the bank and then since I've been at the State Department. And what I believe you all need to be focusing on, and I'm sorry we're not going to get enough time to interact, but I think it goes without saying that the support of disability rights organizations in Africa is critical. We've seen in the United States and countries around the world that to the extent that there are not strong disability rights organizations, governments in fact do not do what they need to do. We certainly saw that in the U.S. Disabled veterans, when they came home after the Second World War, were really the driving champions to make standards for accessibility strong standards, standards that state and federal government adopted with strong engagement from the disability community. And we've seen that with the Americans with Disabilities Act and other laws, that these laws themselves would not have miraculously happened had it not been, in the case of education for parents with children with disabilities, in the area of adults with disabilities, if adults with various forms of disabilities did not come together and really work on strong legislation, not only clearly defining who the population of disabled people are, what discrimination is, but equally important to make sure that the laws that were developed and are in place now are strongly enforced by the federal government. And I think all of you know, because you've lived in Africa and you live in the States, you clearly see some of the major differences, and I would say that some of the differences really are because governments have not developed effective standards, and even if they have effective standards, they are not complying with those standards. So my overall message to you is support legitimate disability rights organizations in Africa. Use your knowledge and experience here in the United States to learn more, and I presume some of you know much about the laws because you're living here, but looking for opportunities of how you could learn more substantively about laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I'll give Jeanette some information that she can send out to you later on, but for example, in the United States we have 10 what we call regional technical assistance centers on the Americans with Disabilities Act. Those technical assistance centers are available for everybody. They're supported by the federal government. You can go online, you can learn more about the specifics of the law, what is a requirement of the law, and if there is a dispute about implementation of the law, the mechanisms that the U.S. government uses through mediation, technical assistance, the availability of individuals to file complaints, and to ultimately, if need be, go to court. We have some really unique opportunities right now. David's been talking about the need for the United States to ratify the Disabilities Treaty. Obviously, that's critically important. If it doesn't happen this year, this is not going to be the end of it. And so I think engaging now, speaking with David later about how you can get involved in the last push, whether or not you know senators, many of you involved in churches and other community groups, and being able to talk with those organizations about what the Disability Treaty is something that David can talk to you more about later. There are good things that are happening in Africa, and I wanted to just give you some highlights of activities that are happening. The State Department and USAID have been funding a number of projects, but also Europeans are funding projects in the area of disability in Africa. And we have an organization, we meaning the world, called IDA, the International Disability Alliance. And IDA has been doing some very significant work in Africa, specifically working in a number of African countries that have ratified the Disabilities Treaty. So let me give you a kind of a quick overview. Government agrees it will ratify the treaty. It is then taking on the obligation to implement the treaty. I encourage all of you to read the treaty. It is not a lengthy document, and it is not legalese. It is something you can understand. You'll see in looking at the treaty the comparisons with the Americans with Disabilities Act, which reading the ADA is much more legalese, but still I would encourage you to look at it. And also if you go to, as I was saying, to the technical assistance centers, the ADA technical assistance centers, there you can get it much more simply. They have great information, simply written, questions, answers that you can understand. But once a country ratifies the treaty, it then has an obligation to report to a committee. It's the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Committee. Government reports, and civil society can do something. It can submit what's called a shadow report. So civil society can submit a report critiquing, commenting on what the government has said. So the government may say, we ratified, everything's rosy, we've done all these things. Civil society may come behind it and say, that's not exactly true. They're not working with us. Look at the data on education. Significant numbers of children are not in school. The government hasn't developed standards. Discrimination in employment, blah, 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 blah. Then the CRPD committee, which works out of Geneva and is made up of representatives from around the world, will look at both the government report and the civil society reports. So this organization, called the International Disability Alliance, has been focusing a lot of attention in many countries in Africa and others to help civil society become more organized. like in the United States, I mean, I'm 60, almost 67, so when I was born in 47, I had polio in 49. We had no laws in place. So there have been dramatic changes, but those changes only came about because my parents fought for this, the veterans were fighting, and then disabled people, as we were growing up, we began to form organizations. We moved away from the cure component and moved to the advocacy and rights-based. And I think you see this going on across Africa, the women's movement and other movements that have been developing in Africa, giving people voice so that they in fact can work and demand their rights. And that's really what we're talking about in any country around the world. No voice, no action. There's too many problems going on in countries. Disabled people are somehow considered something other than human beings, and so we have to wait for everything else to happen before disability comes into the queue, and that's ridiculous. We know that issues like gender-based violence, huge numbers of disabled women or women who experience gender-based violence become disabled as a result of that experience. And we know in the U.S., and the data will be no different anywhere else, that the rate of violence against disabled people in the U.S., in England, all across the world, is staggering. So it will not be any better in Africa. So there you've got gender-based violence, huge numbers of people who had disabilities and experience violence because of their disabilities, because they're considered vulnerable, because they're considered not to be good witnesses and become prey for that, or they become disabled as a result of that experience. Or in conflict situations where people are becoming disabled, physically disabled, sensorially disabled, mental health disabilities. I mean, the numbers are staggering, and there's a weak infrastructure in many countries. What can you be doing? I think you need to immerse yourself. You need to really join disability rights organizations in your communities. You need to look at both your businesses and the religious communities that you're living in. You need to expand your group. You're a huge percentage of people in the United States, and you need to use your voices. My perception, you wouldn't be here today if you didn't have some interest in disability. Whether it's because of yourself or a family member or work that you're doing, you wouldn't be in this room today. So we need to multiply this. There are lots of opportunities. One is working on the treaty. The other is next year is the 25th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the State Department is reaching out to our embassies around the world to say, please highlight the ADA in country. So if you are doing any work with any of the U.S. embassies overseas, this is also something you can let us know about. Go directly to people you know in the embassies and say, yes, we believe it's an important thing to really highlight various issues. So it can be on, for example, what's going on in a particular country in the area of higher education. We know in Ethiopia there's some good work that's going on in the area of higher education. South Africa has some great work going on. Kenya, many countries have things that are happening. Linking it to the Americans with Disabilities Act, helping people learn more about this law and how to help it become modeled in the countries that you come from. That's what this is all about. As David said, 1 billion people in the world have disabilities. That's 15%. That number, when finally there was more accurate data, went from a made-up figure of 10% to at least 15% according to the World Bank. And if you look at developed countries, quote unquote, like the United States and Canada and Australia, etc., the figures there are 18 to 22%. So one can assume that 15% is definitely not the ceiling. It's the middle. Let me also mention a couple of other organizations. I've mentioned the International Disability Alliance. There's also a group called IDDC, which is in Europe, and EDF, which is another group in Europe that's also been doing work in Africa. There's another organization called the Abilis Foundation, which is based in Finland, and Finland has been doing work in a few countries within Africa, Ethiopia being one of those countries, and Kenya. In Ethiopia, they've been both supporting the Ethiopian Center on Disability and Development, and they're now starting a 5th project in Ethiopia specifically focusing on making universities more accessible. There are a couple of foundations I wanted to mention to you. The Disability Rights Fund, which is a U.S. foundation based in Boston. They've been doing a reasonable amount of work in Africa. Something called OSF, the Open Society Foundation. They've also been doing work in Africa. A lot of the work that they've been doing has been focusing on community organizing, also working in the area of youth with disabilities. There's some good work going on in Africa, focusing on training of lawyers and others on legal issues and looking at African law and how to train people to be able to work on the Disabilities Treaty using African legal structures. And I just want to conclude by saying the State Department is definitely interested in continuing to work with you. We see you as a tremendous resource because from my perspective, you really have a real understanding of what is going on in the country that you've come from. You're involved, you want to help, and for us, that's the best. People who have real life experience and can really work with organizations in the United States so that people can really understand both what the plight is, but then you can help people back at home really understand that there is no reason they should not have a vision in the next 10 to 20 years that they can create communities like we have all across this country. But it starts at the grassroots. It starts with local organizations. It starts with empowerment. It starts with allowing people, disabled people and family members, to really believe that they have the same rights as everyone else, and it's all of our responsibility here to help make sure that people get the tools that they need to be able to do what they know needs to be done. State has recently given a grant, awarded a grant, we didn't give it, it was a competitive grant, that's going to 4 groups, Mobility International USA, David's organization, UCID, a group called IFAS, which works on election reform, and another organization called the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. It's a pilot project. There's one country in Asia, Vietnam, another country in Africa, Kenya, and the 3rd country will be in Mexico. That project is going to be working with the disability community in these respective countries to help them learn more about our laws. And it's a great consortium of groups who've got great experience here and good experience also working internationally. So thank you. This is only a beginning. I've already told Jeanette that we're happy to do a conference call or a meeting in the future over the next couple of months. And for me, it's equally important for us to understand what it is you're doing, what your experiences are, as it is for us to share with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Judy. You have raised through a number of points that you've raised. Indeed, we know our countries well. We know what the situations are there, and we are just so glad that we have spokespersons and representatives like yourselves that recognize that we can do something by encouraging those from our respective countries that they should have a vision and insist on being treated like everyone else, and that there are organizations out there that will be ready to work with them. Thank you so very much. Now, our next, the next program, Jeanette, are you around? Are we breaking out in groups, or because I see panel 1 or panel 2? Yes. So while I am talking to just asking Jeanette about this, I didn't, and I should have at the beginning of this this event. Jeanette Carligill is the disability voice in the bank. I'll tell you that outright. She works tirelessly, sometimes even risking her own work program, to make sure that the disability voice remains out there, and that everybody is hearing and knowing that there's a disability program. From within the bank, I would say single-handedly, she organized this event, working, of course, with John, who is a retired colleague. But Jeanette organized everything by herself. Even though the World Bank Group, IMF African Society, of which I'm chair, is an organization with hundreds of members, 1,500, and half of them are here in headquarters. Jeanette did not wait to say, oh, where is everybody to help me? Or she did everything, really. And I want us to give a round of applause right now, please. And applause to John as well. Dr. John Riverson. So thank you, and we are going to have the next happening here is going to be a panel 1 presentation, and this will be about inclusion of women, of African women with disabilities in STEM education. And then, wait a minute, am I correct? Yes, STEM education. The plight of women with fistula in Africa, the case of Ethiopia, inclusive education in Cameroon. So the first one, inclusion of African women with disabilities in STEM education, will be presented by Dr. Pius Kamau. And the plight of women with fistula in Africa, the case of Ethiopia, will be presented by Dr. John Riverson. And the third one, the inclusive education in Cameroon, will be presented by Dr. Margaret Beseha.